His son fired and humiliated him for being old and useless. The grandfather left in silence, but hid a key. Years later, his grandson found the vault and uncovered a truth no one imagined. With trembling hands and his badge being stripped in front of students and teachers, George could barely look at his own son, the man who had just fired him for being useless. As the rain began to fall, he walked away in silence, but left behind a key and a secret. The digital clock on the wall of Lincoln Elementary School flickered as George Williams struggled with the new security system. His weathered hands, marked by 7 decades of hard work, trembled slightly as he punched in numbers that refused to cooperate. "For God's sake, Dad, it's not that complicated," Ethan Williams hissed, his voice low but sharp enough to cut. The new school manager, George's own son, stood with perfect posture in his tailored suit, clipboard clutched tightly against his chest. A small group of 5th graders lingered nearby, pretending not to watch. "I'm trying, son," George whispered, his eyes squinting behind outdated glasses. "They changed everything yesterday." "No, they changed it last month. I sent a memo." Ethan's patience had worn thin. "Everyone else figured it out." 10-year-old Lucas Williams shifted uncomfortably behind his father, clutching his backpack. He loved visiting his grandfather at work, but lately his dad seemed angry whenever Grandpa was around. "Mr. Williams, perhaps we should discuss updating security protocols," Ms. Abernathy, the assistant principal, suggested as she approached. "Considering recent events?" "Yes, considering recent events." Ethan's voice hardened as he straightened his tie. "Dad, my office. Now." The walk down the hallway felt endless. Lucas trailed behind, catching fragments of whispered conversations from teachers. Something about budget cuts, something about modernization. Inside the office, rain began pattering against the window. Ethan closed the door, but didn't bother lowering his voice. "You've been warned 3 times about the new systems. The board is watching every mistake." George stood quietly, hands folded before him. "I'll do better, son." "No, you won't." Ethan slammed a folder onto the desk. "We're cutting positions. The school needs a modern security team, not this." "This?" George's voice remained soft. "Someone who can't adapt. Someone who's becoming a liability." Ethan wouldn't meet his father's eyes. "The board reviewed your file. It's been decided. Today is your last day." Lucas gasped from the corner where he sat. He hadn't meant to make a sound. Ethan turned, noticing his son for the first time. "Lucas, wait outside." But Dad..." "Now." Lucas slipped out, but the door didn't fully close. Through the crack, he watched his grandfather remove his security badge with dignified slowness. There was no argument, no defense, just the quiet acceptance that surprised Lucas most of all. "I understand," George said finally. "Can I clean out my locker?" Hours later, at home, the silence was deafening. Lucas watched from the staircase as his grandfather packed a small suitcase in the guest room. His mother, Rachel, moved through the kitchen, speaking in hushed tones on the phone, occasionally glancing toward the stairs with worried eyes. "Can't just throw him out, Ethan," Lucas heard her whisper harshly. When George emerged with his suitcase, no one spoke. No hugs were exchanged. The old man simply nodded to Rachel, then paused by the coat closet near Lucas's room. "Grandpa," Lucas whispered, his voice small. George turned, his eyes crinkled with a smile that didn't quite reach his lips. Without a word, he opened the closet door, reached inside, and tucked something small into the toe of an old winter sock buried in the back corner. A metallic glint caught Lucas's eye. A key. "What's that for?" the boy asked. George simply placed a finger to his lips. "Some things are worth keeping quiet about, little man." He ruffled Lucas's hair gently. Sometimes silence says more than words ever could. By morning, George was gone, vanished like the rain clouds that had emptied themselves the night before. Lucas checked the driveway, the backyard, even the garden shed. When he asked where Grandpa had gone, his father's face hardened. He decided it was time to move on. "We won't talk about this again." And they didn't. Within a month, all photographs of George were removed from the mantel. By Christmas, his name had become a forbidden word in the Williams household. The sock in the closet remained untouched, the key inside forgotten by everyone but Lucas, who sometimes stared at the closet door and wondered what secrets a single key could possibly hold. He was a burden who refused to evolve. Rachel's words floated up the stairwell as Lucas pretended to do homework. 3 years had passed since his grandfather's disappearance, and the 13-year-old had learned that eavesdropping was the only way to hear George's name spoken aloud. "My father understood his limitations," Ethan replied, glass clinking against ice in the living room below. "It was better this way." Better for whom? Lucas wondered, tracing his pencil absently over math problems he'd already solved. The house had changed. Fresh paint on the walls, new furniture, and not a single trace of the man who had lived with them for nearly a decade. But Lucas remembered the peppermint candies that would appear mysteriously in his lunchbox. The nonsensical bedtime stories about talking animals and brave little boys. Most of all, he remembered the gentleness in his grandfather's eyes, a softness entirely absent from his father's sharp gaze. "Lucas, dinner!" His mother's voice jolted him from his thoughts. At the dining table, conversation revolved around his father's latest promotion. The school district was expanding, and Ethan Williams was now overseeing 3 elementary schools, including Lincoln, where it had all begun. "We've completely modernized security," Ethan announced proudly. "Facial recognition at every entrance. The old system was practically medieval." Lucas pushed peas around his plate. "Did Grandpa ever learn to use computers?" The silence was immediate. His mother's fork froze midway to her mouth. His father's jaw tightened. "We don't discuss that, Lucas. You know the rules." "But I was just..." "Enough." Ethan's palm slammed the table. "That chapter is closed." Later that week at the school's spring festival, Lucas wandered past game booths and cotton candy stands, half listening to his friends debate which rides were worth their tickets. A movement caught his eye, an elderly man in faded overalls sweeping fallen cherry blossoms from the sidewalk. It wasn't George. This man was shorter, bolder, but something about the careful, methodical movement of the broom across pavement made Lucas's throat tighten unexpectedly. He stood transfixed until the man looked up and offered a friendly nod. "You okay there, young fella?" Lucas blinked rapidly. "Yes, sir. You reminded me of someone." The old man leaned on his broom. "Someone important?" "My grandfather. He used to work here." The words tumbled out before Lucas could stop them. "What's his name?" "I might know him." "George Williams." The man's smile faded slightly. "George? Sure, I knew George. Good man, very good man." He glanced over Lucas's shoulder, then lowered his voice. "He helped a lot of folks around here, you know. Quiet about it, though. Never wanted credit." Lucas stepped closer. "Do you know where he went? After..." "Lucas!" His father's voice cut through the conversation like a knife. "We're leaving, now!" As Ethan dragged him away, Lucas looked back at the old janitor, who offered only a sad smile and a small wave of his gnarled hand. That night, Lucas dreamed of his grandfather sitting in the old rocking chair, telling stories about hidden treasures and secret maps. He woke suddenly, heart pounding, and crept to his closet. The sock was still there, pushed deep into the corner, the small brass key still nestled inside. Whatever it opened, wherever it led, Lucas promised himself that someday he would find out. He would find the lock that matched this key. And maybe, just maybe, he would find his grandfather too. For now, though, he replaced the sock, closed the closet door, and returned to bed. In a house where silence had become law, some secrets were better kept hidden, but not forgotten. Never forgotten. "I'm sorry for your loss, Mr. Williams." Lucas nodded mechanically at the funeral director, accepting the man's practiced sympathy with a handshake that felt disconnected from his body. At 32, Lucas had built a life far from his childhood home, a sleek apartment in Manhattan, a corner office at a tech investment firm, occasional dates with women whose names sometimes blurred together. None of it seemed real as he stood in the funeral home in his hometown, watching distant relatives drift past his father's closed casket. The heart attack had been sudden. One moment, Ethan Williams was berating a contractor about insufficient security cameras at Lincoln Elementary. The next, he was on the floor, gasping for breath that wouldn't come. "He was so young," Lucas's mother whispered beside him, her face pale beneath carefully applied makeup. "Only 58. Rachel had aged dramatically in the years since Lucas left for college. Now, in her grief, she looked positively frail. The black dress hung from shoulders that seemed too sharp, too angular. "Did you contact everyone?" Lucas asked. He'd been asking practical questions for days, partly because no one else would, partly because they allowed him to avoid the deeper emotions threatening to surface. Rachel nodded absently. Everyone who mattered. The unspoken name hung between them. George. Would he have come if he'd known? Was he even still alive? After the service, a parade of dark vehicles made their way to the family home, the same house where Lucas had grown up, now updated with modern fixtures and neutral paint colors that erased any trace of the past. As executor of his father's will, Lucas found himself in Ethan's home office, surrounded by meticulous files and digital backups. "Your father was always organized," the family lawyer commented, sliding a thick envelope across the desk. "Everything spelled out clearly, no surprises." But there was one surprise. Among the property declarations and investment portfolios, Lucas discovered a deed he didn't recognize. His grandmother's old house, a small bungalow across town that had sat empty since her death 15 years ago. His father had kept it, paid taxes on it, but never sold or rented it. Most surprisingly, it was now in Lucas's name. "I thought Dad sold this years ago," Lucas murmured, examining the yellowed paper. The lawyer shrugged. "Some people hold on to property for sentimental reasons." Sentiment wasn't a word Lucas associated with his father. Pragmatism, efficiency, control, these were Ethan's guiding principles. Why keep an empty house for decades? 2 days later, after the last relatives had departed and his mother had retreated into prescription-aided sleep, Lucas drove across town to the forgotten property. The neighborhood had declined. Once pristine lawns now overgrown, several houses boarded up. His grandmother's home stood like a time capsule, the peeling paint and sagging porch untouched by the renovations that had erased family history everywhere else. The key from his father's files slid easily into the front door lock. Inside, dust motes danced in shafts of afternoon sunlight. Furniture draped in yellowed sheets created ghostly silhouettes. The air smelled of disuse and faded memories. Lucas moved through rooms, preserved in amber, his grandmother's floral curtains still hanging, kitchen cabinets still stocked with ancient canned goods, his grandfather's favorite armchair still positioned by the window where he used to read the newspaper. It was as if someone had expected them to return at any moment. In what had once been his father's childhood bedroom, Lucas opened the closet almost without thinking. Mothballs and cedar scent wafted out. On the top shelf, shoeboxes labeled in his grandmother's handwriting, Ethan report cards, Ethan Little League, Ethan school photos. As Lucas reached for one, his elbow knocked something to the floor, a single sock, faded and dusty. It skidded across the hardwood, something small and metallic tumbling out. A key, small brass, tarnished with age. Lucas stared, memory flooding back like a physical force. His grandfather slipping something into the closet. The sock in his own childhood closet that he'd eventually discarded during a move. Some things are worth keeping quiet about, little man. With trembling fingers, Lucas picked up the key, its weight familiar and strange all at once. Whatever his grandfather had hidden, whatever secret he'd kept, the answer was somewhere in this house. And suddenly, Lucas knew with absolute certainty that finding that answer mattered more than anything else in his life. The basement stairs creaked beneath Lucas's weight, each step releasing small clouds of dust into the beam of his phone's flashlight. The air grew cooler, damper as he descended, carrying the mineral scent of old concrete and forgotten spaces. His grandmother's basement had been partially finished once. Paneled walls, indoor-outdoor carpeting in a shade of green no longer manufactured. Now, water stains mapped the ceiling, and mildew spotted the walls. Lucas swept his light across abandoned bicycles, Christmas decorations, and stacks of Reader's Digest collections. "Where would you hide something, Grandpa?" he whispered to the darkness. The old furnace hulked in the corner, a cast-iron monster that had heated the house for decades. Lucas remembered his grandfather's warnings from childhood visits. "Stay away from the furnace, Lucas. That old beast bites." Behind it, perhaps. Lucas squeezed into the narrow space between the furnace and the wall, cobwebs catching in his hair. His light beam caught something, a dull metal reflection, a safe. Small, square, bolted to the concrete floor and partially hidden by the furnace. The kind with a simple key lock rather than a combination dial. Lucas's heart hammered against his ribs as he knelt before it, brushing decades of dust from its surface. The keyhole was tarnished, but intact. With trembling fingers, he inserted the small brass key. It fit. The mechanism resisted at first, stiff from disuse. Lucas applied gentle pressure, feeling the internal tumblers grudgingly shifting. Finally, with a sound like a long-held breath releasing, the lock turned. Inside, the safe was packed with papers, envelopes, notebooks, folded documents. Lucas gathered them carefully, carrying his discovery to a card table nearby. He sorted through with growing astonishment. Bank statements showing regular deposits into accounts for Ethan, Rachel, and even a trust for Lucas himself. Receipts for mortgage payments on their family home. Payments made by George, not Ethan. Tuition bills for Ethan's college education and MBA program, all marked paid in full, with George's signature on the checks. "Oh my God," Lucas whispered, the pieces connecting. More documents revealed the full picture. George had worked 3 jobs for years: school security during the day, night watchman at a warehouse from 11 p.m. to 5 a.m., and weekend maintenance at an apartment complex. The combined income had supported not just himself, but his son's family as well. Deeper in the pile, Lucas found a notebook. The handwriting wasn't his grandfather's, it was neater, feminine. On the first page, George asked me to write these down for him. George, who had never learned to read or write properly. George, who had masked his illiteracy with an incredible memory and quick thinking. George, who had been too proud to admit he couldn't understand the new digital security system. The entries were simple but devastating. November 1995, $4,200 to Ethan's MBA fund. Use this for my son's future. January 1998, $15,000 down payment for Ethan and Rachel's house. Don't tell them it was my money. August 2005, $2,000 for Lucas's braces. My grandson deserves a good smile. Lucas's vision blurred with tears. All those years, his father had projected success and independence while secretly accepting his own father's money, the very man he later humiliated and discarded. Beneath the notebook lay a small envelope. Inside was a check for $500 made out to Lucas Williams, dated for his 11th birthday, 1 year after George had left. It had never been delivered, never deposited. A birthday gift from a grandfather who wasn't allowed to give it in person. Lucas sat back on his heels, mind reeling. The narrative of his childhood, of his strong, self-made father and his supposedly useless grandfather, disintegrated like the dust motes floating through his flashlight beam. "You paid for everything," he whispered to the empty basement, "and he threw you away." As Lucas carefully returned each document to the safe, a final item caught his attention, a faded photograph of himself as a child, sitting on George's lap at a school picnic. On the back, written in that same neat handwriting, "George says this is his favorite picture. He wants Lucas to know he was always proud of him." The silence of the basement felt different now, not empty, but full of unspoken truths, finally revealed. Lucas closed the safe, the click of the lock echoing like the period at the end of a long hidden sentence. He knew, didn't he? Lucas's question hung in the sterile hospital room. His mother looked smaller than ever against the white pillows, the cancer treatments having stripped away what little weight she had left. Rachel Williams turned her face toward the window, afternoon light illuminating the tears she couldn't hide. "Lucas, your father." "Please, Mom, no more lies." Lucas placed the key on her bedside table. "I found Grandpa's safe. I saw the records." A long silence followed, broken only by the rhythmic beeping of monitors. Finally, Rachel closed her eyes. "Yes, he knew." Her voice was barely audible. "Everything." Lucas pulled his chair closer, fighting to keep his tone even. "Dad fired his own father, who was supporting our entire family. Why?" Rachel's hands trembled as she folded them over the thin blanket. "You have to understand what it was like for your father growing up. George was a good man, hard-working, but he never had education, could barely read a newspaper. That doesn't explain." "Ethan was bullied mercilessly as a child. Your dad's the dummy who cleans toilets. Your dad can't even sign his name." It shaped him. Rachel's gaze drifted to old memories. He swore he'd never be seen that way. He needed to be respected, admired. Lucas remembered his father's immaculate suits, his precise diction, his insistence on credentials and titles, armor against childhood wounds. When Ethan got his MBA, he was so proud, but finding a job was harder than he expected. "We were drowning in debt when George offered to help, but instead of being grateful." Your father was ashamed, Lucas, devastated that he needed his uneducated father's money. Each check was like salt in a wound. Lucas recalled his father's outbursts, the rigid rules, the coldness. So he took the money and then punished Grandpa for giving it. Rachel reached for Lucas's hand, her fingers cool and fragile. "I tried to stop him from firing George. I begged him to reconsider. But you didn't fight hard enough." The accusation slipped out before Lucas could stop it. His mother's face crumpled. "No, I didn't. I chose my husband over what was right, and I've regretted it every day since." Tears slid down her hollow cheeks. "The night George left, I found Ethan crying in the garage, actually sobbing, the only time I ever saw him break down." "Dad, crying?" The concept seemed impossible. Rachel nodded. "He said, 'I've become the worst kind of man, the kind who can't face his own reflection.'" "Then why didn't he apologize? Bring Grandpa back?" Pride, shame. The years passed and it became harder to bridge the gap. Then George just vanished. Lucas stood abruptly, pacing to the window. Outside, visitors hurried through the parking lot with flowers and balloons, life continuing while his family's foundations crumbled. "Do you know where he is? Is he even alive?" Rachel hesitated. "About 5 years ago, one of the old school nurses called. She'd seen him at Evergreen Care Center." Lucas whirled around. "A nursing home? Why didn't you tell me? Your father forbade it. Rachel's voice hardened unexpectedly. But I should have told you anyway. Add it to my list of failures. The bitterness in her tone stopped Lucas's anger cold. His mother had made her choices, terrible ones perhaps, but she was paying for them now in regret. He sat back down, gentler this time. Tell me about Grandpa, the real George, not the version Dad created. A faint smile touched Rachel's lips. He was magic with children, not just you, any child. At Christmas, he'd take half his paycheck and buy gifts for kids at the school whose parents couldn't afford them. Never told anyone. I only found out because I saw the receipts once. The nurse at Evergreen, did she say how he was doing? Rachel's face clouded. She mentioned memory problems, early stages, Alzheimer's. The word hung unspoken between them. Lucas gathered his coat. Decision made. I'm going to find him. Lucas, Rachel reached for his hand again. What if he doesn't remember you? The possibility cut deep, but Lucas straightened his shoulders. Then I'll remember for both of us. As he kissed his mother's forehead and turned to leave, she called after him. Lucas, your grandfather once told me something I never forgot. He said, love doesn't need to make noise to be heard. In the corridor, Lucas paused. His father's silence and his grandfather's sacrifice suddenly cast in new light. Some men shouted their importance to anyone who would listen. Others simply acted, quietly bearing the weight of those they loved, asking nothing in return. Lucas knew which kind of man he wanted to be. The Evergreen Care Center sat nestled among rolling hills 40 miles outside the city, its red brick buildings and wide porches more reminiscent of a country inn than a nursing facility. Lucas parked his rental car beneath a towering oak, trying to calm his racing heart. What would George look like after 22 years? Would there be any recognition in his eyes? Rachel's warning echoed. Memory problems, early stages. At the reception desk, a young woman with a bright smile looked up from her computer. How can I help you today? I'm looking for a resident, George Williams. Lucas's voice caught slightly. He's my grandfather. Her smile faltered. Oh, Mr. Williams, let me check his visitor list. The pause stretched uncomfortably as she scrolled through records. I'm sorry, but you're not listed as an approved visitor. His primary contact is... Please, Lucas interrupted. It's been many years since we've seen each other. My father recently passed away, and I just discovered my grandfather was here. Sympathy softened her features. Let me get our director. Wait here. Minutes later, a silver-haired woman with kind eyes approached. Mr. Williams, I'm Dr. Mehra, the center director. Why don't we talk in my office? Once seated in her warmly lit office, Lucas explained the situation, the estrangement, his father's death, the recent discoveries. Dr. Mehra nodded slowly. Your grandfather has been with us for 7 years. Until recently, he was one of our most active residents. He volunteered in our garden, read to other residents who couldn't see well enough to read themselves. Read to them, Lucas repeated, remembering his grandfather's illiteracy. From memory, mostly. Stories he'd heard, I think. He has an extraordinary memory, or did until recently. Her expression turned professional. About 18 months ago, we began noticing signs of cognitive decline, disorientation, memory lapses. It's progressed fairly rapidly. Does he have any visitors, friends? A former nurse from Lincoln Elementary visits occasionally. Otherwise, no. He's been quite alone. The loneliness of that statement hit Lucas like a physical blow. 22 years of solitude. No family at Christmas. No calls on birthdays. Can I see him? Dr. Mehra hesitated. I should prepare you. George has good days and difficult ones. Today has been challenging for him. He may not recognize you, or may become agitated. I understand. She led him through sunlit corridors decorated with residents' artwork, past community rooms where elderly men and women played cards or watched television. They reached a garden courtyard where a white-haired man sat alone on a bench, staring at a bird feeder. Lucas stopped in his tracks. The straight-backed security guard of his childhood had vanished. In his place sat a diminished figure, shoulders curved inward, hands resting limply on knees that seemed too bony beneath worn khakis. "George?" Dr. Mera called gently. "You have a visitor today." The old man turned slowly. Lucas caught his breath. Those eyes, at least, remained unchanged. Clear blue, like a summer sky. "Hello," George said politely, his gaze curious but vacant. Dr. Mera nodded encouragement to Lucas, then retreated to a discreet distance. "Grandpa?" Lucas moved closer, kneeling before the bench. "It's me, Lucas." George's forehead creased with concentration. "Lucas," he repeated as if testing the shape of the name. "Lucas, your grandson, Ethan's son." A shadow crossed the old man's face. "Ethan." The name emerged flat, emotionless. "The school manager." Lucas swallowed hard. "Yes, I found your key, Grandpa, the one you hid in my closet." No response, no recognition. Lucas reached into his pocket, withdrawing something he'd brought from the safe. A folded children's drawing of a rocket ship, signed in crayon, "To Grandpa from Lucas, age 7. George's hand trembled as he accepted the paper. He unfolded it carefully, staring at the childish scrawl for a long moment. Then, like sunrise breaking through clouds, his face transformed. "My little miracle," he whispered, looking up at Lucas with suddenly clear eyes. "You found me." Lucas couldn't speak past the knot in his throat. He simply nodded, tears spilling onto his cheeks. George reached out, his weathered hand cupping Lucas's face with surprising strength. "Your father! He's gone, Grandpa. He passed away." George absorbed this without visible reaction. "And you came looking for me?" "As soon as I found out where you were." The old man nodded as if confirming something to himself. Then his gaze drifted past Lucas, focusing on something invisible in the middle distance. "The school," he murmured. "So many children. Backpacks too heavy. Little shoulders. I fixed the drinking fountain last week. Principal said it couldn't be fixed." The sudden shift into confusion was jarring. Lucas glanced at Dr. Mera, who moved closer. "George sometimes moves between past and present," she explained quietly. "It's normal with his condition." Lucas turned back to his grandfather, whose attention had shifted to a robin hopping near the feeder. "Grandpa, I'll come back tomorrow, is that okay?" George looked at him with an odd mixture of clarity and distance. "Tomorrow," he agreed. Then, with surprising urgency, he gripped Lucas's wrist. "The backpacks. Check the backpacks." "What backpacks, Grandpa?" But George had already retreated into whatever fragmented world his mind now inhabited, his gaze returning to the birds that flitted through the garden. As Lucas walked back to his car, emotions warred within him. Relief at having found George, grief for the years lost, and a burning question about what secrets still remained locked in his grandfather's fading memory. "The backpacks," he whispered to himself. "What about the backpacks?" "He was asking about you all morning." Nurse Bennett smiled as she walked Lucas to the garden the next day. A stocky woman in her 60s with salt and pepper hair, she'd been at Lincoln Elementary during George's tenure. "Kept saying his grandson was coming. It's the most lucid he's been in weeks." Lucas couldn't hide his surprise. "He remembers me? After yesterday?" That's how Alzheimer's works sometimes. Unpredictable. A fog that lifts and falls without warning. She patted his arm. "Treasure the clear moments when they come." Today, George sat at a small table in the garden, dressed in a freshly ironed shirt, hair combed neatly. He stood when he saw Lucas, a formal gesture from a more dignified era. "You came back," he said, extending a hand to shake. "Lucas, I promised I would." Lucas embraced him instead of shaking hands. After a moment's hesitation, George returned the hug, his frame feeling impossibly fragile beneath the crisp cotton shirt. Nurse Bennet discreetly withdrew, leaving them alone among flowering bushes and humming bees. "Did you bring more drawings?" George asked eagerly. "No, but I brought photos." Lucas produced an envelope. "I thought they might help you remember." They spent an hour with the photographs. George at Lucas's Little League games, family Christmases, school events. Some triggered detailed memories, others drew blank stares. The randomness of what remained intact and what had been erased was heartbreaking. "Grandpa," Lucas asked during a moment of clarity, "yesterday you mentioned backpacks. What did you mean?" George's forehead furrowed. "Backpacks, heavy backpacks." "At the school, too heavy for little shoulders." George nodded with sudden certainty. "I helped them." Before Lucas could press further, Nurse Bennet returned. "George, it's time for your physical therapy. And Lucas, doctor. Mara would like to see you in her office." "I'll be back tomorrow," Lucas promised, squeezing his grandfather's shoulder. "You say that every time," George replied with unexpected clarity, his blue eyes suddenly sharp with hurt. The comment stung like an accusation. Every time? This was only his second visit. Then Lucas realized, in George's fractured reality, perhaps every departure felt like the original abandonment. "I will come back," Lucas repeated firmly. "I promise." In Dr. Mara's office, the director waited with a battered composition notebook on her desk. "George asked me to give you this," she explained. "He's been keeping it for years, or rather, having others keep it for him." Lucas accepted the notebook curiously. Inside, different handwritings filled the pages. Staff members who had written down George's words when his own hand couldn't form the letters he never learned to write. The earliest entries dated back 15 years. September 14th, sent $200 to Lincoln Elementary for art supplies. The district cut the budget again. October 30th, donated winter coats to Johnson family. 3 children, no father. Don't tell them where they came from. Page after page documented small acts of generosity from a man who had barely enough for himself. More recent entries revealed something even more surprising. Nurse Alicia wrote this for George. "Remember to check on Lucas. He's at Columbia now. Engineering program, so proud. Lucas would be 25 today. Hope he's happy. Hope he remembers his old grandpa sometimes." "He was tracking my life," Lucas whispered, astonished. "But how? We had no contact." Dr. Mera smiled gently. "From what I understand, he maintained connections with several teachers and staff at Lincoln Elementary. They would pass along news of you, your graduations, jobs, whatever they heard from your father." The thought of his grandfather collecting second-hand news about his life, treasuring these fragments from afar, made Lucas's chest ache. Deeper in the notebook, Lucas found something that stopped his breath entirely. January 15th, donated hearing aids for Daniel Rodriguez, 6A. His family can't afford them. School nurse will handle it discreetly. $1,700 from my savings. Dozens of similar entries followed: medical treatments, school supplies, winter clothing, even rent payments for families facing eviction. All anonymous. All from the meager savings of a retired school custodian. He called it his backpack fund, Dr. Mera explained, seeing Lucas's confusion. "He told me once that he could always tell which children needed help by how they carried their backpacks, slightly ashamed, careful not to draw attention." The memory of George's urgent message clicked into place. "Check the backpacks." "He spent his retirement helping strangers' children," Lucas said, voice thick with emotion, "while his own family threw him away." George never saw it that way, Dr. Mera replied gently. He told me once, what good is living if you're not lightening someone else's load? Lucas closed the notebook, overwhelmed. The humble custodian who couldn't operate a digital security system had quietly changed hundreds of lives while asking nothing in return, not even acknowledgement. Can I keep this? He asked. Of course. It belongs to you now. Dr. Mera hesitated, then added carefully, Lucas, you should know. George's condition is progressing rapidly. The moments of clarity you saw today will become rarer. Lucas nodded, understanding the unspoken warning. Time was running out. I'll be back tomorrow, he said, clutching the notebook to his chest. And every day after that. Lucas cancelled his return flight to New York. He postponed meetings, delegated projects, and rented a small apartment near Evergreen. His colleagues were baffled, his girlfriend increasingly frustrated by his prolonged absence. None of it mattered. For the first time in his life, Lucas was exactly where he needed to be. Each morning, he arrived at Evergreen as the sun crested the eastern hills. Each evening, he left only when George had fallen asleep. Between, they lived a lifetime of moments, some clear and connected, others fragmented by George's advancing disease. On good days, George recognized him immediately, eyes lighting up with joy. They'd sit in the garden, Lucas reading aloud from the newspaper or describing his life in New York. George listened intently, asking thoughtful questions that revealed the sharp mind, still occasionally breaking through the fog. On difficult days, Lucas was a stranger. George would grow agitated, asking repeatedly for his son, Ethan, or believing himself back at Lincoln Elementary, worrying about locked doors and children's safety. It's the disease's progression, Dr. Mera explained during their weekly updates. The recent past disappears first. He'll increasingly retreat into older memories. 3 weeks into his stay, Lucas arrived to find George's room empty, the bed neatly made. Emergency room, Nurse Bennett explained, her expression grave. Last night, pneumonia. The hospital room was dim, machines beeping softly in the half-light. George lay still beneath a thin blanket, oxygen mask obscuring half his face. He seemed to have diminished overnight, shoulders sharp beneath the hospital gown, skin translucent over blue veins. Lucas pulled a chair to the bedside, taking his grandfather's cool hand between his own. I'm here, Grandpa. No response. Just the rhythmic wheeze of assisted breathing. Hours passed. Lucas spoke quietly, sharing memories, reading from the notebook, occasionally wiping moisture from his eyes. Outside the window, daylight faded into dusk, then darkness. Nurses came and went, adjusting monitors, checking vitals. You should get some rest, one suggested gently. We'll call if there's any change. Lucas shook his head. I'm staying. Near dawn, George's breathing changed. More labored, irregular. Lucas pressed the call button, and a nurse quickly appeared, checking monitors with practiced efficiency. I'll get the doctor, she said, hurrying out. Alone again, Lucas squeezed his grandfather's hand. It's okay, Grandpa. I'm right here. George's eyelids fluttered, then opened. For one heart-stopping moment, perfect clarity shone in those blue eyes. His lips moved beneath the oxygen mask. Lucas carefully lifted the mask aside. What is it, Grandpa? Thank you, George whispered, voice barely audible, for not forgetting what no one saw. A single tear tracked down the old man's weathered cheek. Then his eyes closed, his chest fell, and the monitors began their high-pitched alarm. Lucas sat motionless as medical staff rushed in, as procedures were performed, as time of death was pronounced. He remained still as they quietly withdrew, leaving him alone with the grandfather he'd found too late. When he finally stood, legs stiff from hours of sitting, Lucas noticed something beneath the bed, a faded backpack, its blue canvas worn at the corners. His name was embroidered across the front pocket in careful, uneven stitches. Inside the backpack, he found a folded sheet of paper. The handwriting was Nurse Bennett's, but the words were unmistakably George's. I never learned to write, but I learned to love in silence. Teach this to your son someday. Lucas pressed the note to his heart, tears flowing freely now. In the quiet hospital room, as morning light began to filter through the blinds, a lifetime of silence finally spoke volumes. Grey clouds hung low over Oakwood Cemetery, occasional raindrops pattering against the small green tent erected for the service. Beneath it, George's simple casket rested on mechanical straps above the open grave. Despite Lucas's efforts to spread the word, barely a dozen mourners stood in attendance. The pastor, who had never met George, delivered a generic eulogy about a life well lived and eternal reward. His words echoed hollow across the rain-soaked grass. When the perfunctory service concluded, the pastor nodded to Lucas. "Would the family like to say a few words before we commit the body?" Lucas approached the podium, throat tight. He had prepared notes, but now set them aside, instead reaching into his pocket for the worn notebook. "My grandfather was functionally illiterate," he began, his voice gaining strength as he spoke. "He could sign his name and read basic words, but that was all. The world of books, newspapers, and written instructions was largely closed to him." A few mourners shifted uncomfortably at this blunt admission. "And yet," Lucas continued, "he understood something many educated people never learn, that true worth isn't measured by degrees or bank accounts, but by the lives you touch when no one's looking." Lucas opened the notebook, reading excerpts documenting George's quiet generosity. The hearing aids for a child whose family couldn't afford them, winter coats for children who came to school shivering, groceries delivered anonymously to families in need. "My grandfather lived in poverty, so others could live with dignity," Lucas said, voice breaking. "He accepted humiliation so his son, my father, could hold his head high. He worked 3 jobs so I could go to summer camp and have braces and never know we couldn't afford these things." In the back row, an elderly woman dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. "I found a safe in his old house," Lucas continued. "Inside was a check made out to me for my 11th birthday, 1 year after he left our family. He never stopped thinking about us, even when we stopped thinking about him." The rain increased, drumming against the tent. Lucas raised his voice to be heard. "George Williams was invisible to most people, a janitor you passed in the hallway without a second glance, the old man who swept up after school events. But to hundreds of children at Lincoln Elementary, he was an anonymous guardian angel. To me, he was the definition of true strength, the kind that doesn't need to announce itself." A movement caught Lucas's attention. The elderly woman in the back row had stood up. She approached slowly, leaning heavily on a cane. "May I speak?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. Lucas nodded, stepping aside. "I'm Margaret Dawson. I taught 3rd grade at Lincoln for 30 years. She turned to face the small gathering. "What this young man says is true, but it doesn't capture half of what George did." Margaret described how George had quietly maintained the school building with ingenuity and determination, despite budget cuts. Fixing leaky pipes with parts purchased from his own pocket, repainting classrooms on weekends, building bookshelves from scrap lumber. "But most importantly," she continued, voice strengthening, "when Tom Jenkins was about to lose his house after his wife's cancer treatments bankrupted them, it was George who gave him 6 months' worth of mortgage payments, anonymously. I only know because I helped him write the check." Lucas stared at the former teacher in shock. He hadn't known this story. Another mourner stood, a middle-aged man in a postal uniform. "George paid for my daughter's first semester of community college. Said education was too important to delay. I tried to pay him back when I got on my feet, but he wouldn't hear of it. One by one, attendees rose to share similar stories, small and large kindnesses performed by a man who could barely write his own name, but understood the language of compassion better than most. As the impromptu testimonials continued, more people arrived, former colleagues, teachers, families who had benefited from George's generosity. They came with umbrellas and flowers, standing in the rain when the tent could hold no more. By the time the last person spoke, the small service had swelled to over 50 mourners. The invisible man had, in death, finally become visible through the lives he had touched. When the casket was lowered into the earth, Lucas stood with a newfound family, not of blood, but of shared gratitude for a quiet hero who had asked for nothing and given everything. Rain fell like tears from a sky in morning, but Lucas felt a strange peace settle over him. His grandfather's legacy wasn't buried in that grave. It lived on in the stories shared today, in the lives changed through simple acts of kindness, and in Lucas himself, who now understood what real strength looked like. "Thank you," he whispered as the first handful of earth fell onto the casket, "for everything you gave, for everything you taught me without saying a word." 6 months after George's funeral, Lucas sat in a sterile conference room at the district school board offices. The table before him was crowded with architectural plans, budget proposals, and his carefully prepared presentation. "Mr. Williams," the board president began, "we've reviewed your proposal regarding the rebuilding of Lincoln Elementary. While we appreciate your generous financial contribution, there are concerns about your request for the naming rights." Lucas had expected resistance. After returning to New York and resigning from his investment firm, he'd established the George Williams Foundation, dedicated to supporting education and social services for underprivileged children. His first major project was rebuilding the aging Lincoln Elementary with one non-negotiable condition. "My grandfather served that school for 40 years, Lucas replied calmly. "He embodied everything education should represent, not just academic achievement, but character, compassion, and service." The board members exchanged uncomfortable glances. "We typically name schools after more distinguished individuals," a gray-haired woman explained delicately. "Educators, community leaders, historical figures." "Distinguished," Lucas repeated, letting the word hang in the air. "My grandfather couldn't write a proper sentence. He mopped floors and fixed toilets. But he put more children through college than some scholarship programs. He kept families in their homes during hard times. He changed lives without anyone knowing his name." He opened the folder before him, sliding forward copies of the notebook. George's record of quiet generosity, now transcribed and annotated with testimonials from those he'd helped. "This is distinguished service," Lucas said firmly. "Not with titles or public recognition, but with actions that speak louder than any credentials." The board members read in silence, expression shifting from skepticism to surprise. "We had no idea," the president finally admitted. "This is quite remarkable." "That was the point," Lucas replied. "My grandfather never wanted recognition, but now his story deserves to be told, not as charity but as inspiration." 3 months later, on a crisp autumn morning, Lucas stood before the gleaming new building, watching as workers carefully installed the bronze sign above the entrance. "George Williams Elementary School, where silent heroes are made." Hundreds of community members had gathered for the ceremony, families, teachers, former students, many of whom had shared stories of George's impact on their lives. As Lucas prepared to address the crowd, a small hand tugged at his sleeve. He looked down to see a boy of about 5, with serious brown eyes and a Batman backpack nearly as big as he was. "Are you Lucas?" the child asked. Lucas knelt to eye level. "I am. What's your name?" "Mateo. My mommy says I'm going to school here." He pointed to the building with pride. "Who's George Williams?" The simple question caught Lucas by surprise. How to explain his grandfather's legacy to a child who would never know him? "George Williams," Lucas began, "was the man who taught me that the greatest love is the one nobody sees." Mateo considered this, head tilted thoughtfully. "Like superheroes with secret identities?" Lucas smiled. "Exactly like that." After the ceremony, as the crowd dispersed toward the reception, the school principal approached with an envelope in her hand. "Mr. Williams, we found something during the final construction inspection that I think you should see." She passed him the envelope, slightly yellowed with age. It was sealed inside a wall cavity near the old teacher's lounge. Lucas opened it carefully. Inside was a donation receipt from 20 years earlier, funds given anonymously for the school's first computer lab, and a handwritten note on lined paper. "If anyone ever finds this, tell my grandson Lucas that he was always my greatest hope." Standing before the school that now bore his grandfather's name, Lucas felt tears well up. For the first time, George's silence had been broken, his legacy now visible for all to see. His name spoken daily by children who would learn not just reading and mathematics, but the quiet power of compassion. "I hope I'm making you proud, Grandpa," Lucas whispered. As if in answer, a gust of autumn wind swept across the schoolyard, rustling through trees whose leaves had turned the same bright blue as George's eyes. The bronze letters of his name caught the sunlight, gleaming like a beacon against the red brick. Some names are too small for plaques, yet too large to be forgotten. George Williams, once invisible, now immortal in the echoes of children's laughter and the quiet acts of kindness his story would inspire for generations to come. "Daddy?" a small voice called from nearby. "Is this where your grandpa worked?" Lucas turned to his 4-year-old son named George after the man he would never meet, but whose legacy he would inherit. "Yes, buddy. This is where he changed the world, one backpack at a time." Little George nodded solemnly, taking his father's hand as they walked toward the school's open doors. A silent vault of memories now unlocked for all to share. George never needed applause nor recognition. He simply loved, gave, and remained silent. But in the end, his quiet legacy spoke louder than any speech, louder than any title or award. This story is a reminder that some of the greatest heroes in life are not the ones who stand in the spotlight, but those who stand behind us, supporting, sacrificing, and believing even when no one sees. Perhaps the most powerful love is the one that leaves no fingerprints, only warmth. And now we ask you, in your own life, is there someone who loved you in silence? And what did you think of George's journey? We'd love to hear your thoughts. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and click the bell icon so you never miss another emotional journey like this one. Leave a like if this story moved you, and please comment below telling us which country or city you're watching from. It really helps us create more stories that resonate with your reality. Also, don't miss the next unforgettable story by clicking the video that appears on your screen now. Thank you so much for watching and for being part of this beautiful community.